The sound arrived before anything else did. It cracked off the rubber floor mats and bounced off the steel weight racks and climbed all the way up to the fluorescent lights humming 12 feet overhead. And it was the kind of sound that reaches inside a person before their brain has finished deciding what it is. Sharp, deliberate, unmistakable. The sound of a large hand coming down hard across a woman's body in a room full of people who were not going to say a word about it. Officer Craig Dalton stood there in the middle of Ironwood Gym on a Tuesday afternoon and grinned, and the grin was the worst part of it, because it was the grin of a man who had done this before and had never once been handed a reason to stop the grin of someone who understood perfectly that the silence filling the room after that sound was not discomfort. It was permission, and he had learned to read permission in every form it took, including the form where 20 adults find something very interesting to look at, on the floor or the ceiling or the far wall, rather than at the woman standing 3 feet from him with her jaw set and her eyes absolutely still. His partner, Pete Garner, laughed the way men laugh when they are following a lead when someone else has done the thing and all they have to do is confirm. It was funny, and he slapped his own knee once and shook his head like he was watching a highlight reel of something he'd seen before and had been hoping to see again. Gary Mullen, who owned this gym and whose name was on every piece of paper associated with it, was standing 15 feet away, holding a clipboard. He was not reading, and he cleared his throat softly and looked at a point somewhere between the floor and the exit and said nothing at all, and that nothing was its own kind of statement, the loudest thing in the room. 20 people in that gym. Equipment humming. Music low through the overhead speakers. Not one voice. Dalton absorbed the silence the way a man absorbs applause. He shrugged, adjusted the strap of his gym bag, and looked at the woman with the expression of someone who has never once in his life been genuinely inconvenienced. Here is the one thing you need to know before this story goes where it goes. The woman standing in that gym had a title fight in 5 weeks. And somewhere in that room someone had already pressed record. What Dalton didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the 47 seconds on Renata Voss's phone were going to end his career, his freedom, and every version of himself he had ever been comfortable being. Stay with us, because this story does not stop where he thought it would. Not even close. Simone Hayes had been coming to Ironwood Gym since she was 21 years old. 8 years, which sounds like a simple number until you understand what 8 years in a place like this actually means. It means the same bench in the women's locker room, the same hooks on the same wall, the same particular creak of the third floorboard between the entrance and the squat rack that she had stopped noticing after the first month, and that now registered somewhere below conscious thought. The way a person stops hearing the sound of their own heartbeat, even though it never stops being there. 8 years of arriving before dawn when the parking lot was empty and the fluorescent lights were still warming up and the whole place had that particular stillness that only exists in a gym before anyone has started working. The stillness that feels like potential, waiting to be spent, and she would spend it every time until there was nothing left to spend, and then she would lie flat on the mat and stare at the water-stained ceiling tiles and wait for the world to come back into focus. And then she would get up and come back the next day and do it again. She had started with taped wrists and chalk-dusted hands and a coach who had found something in her that she hadn't fully found in herself yet, and she had built something out of those raw materials that now had a record attached to it, that now had a ranking attached to it, that now had a title fight in 5 weeks attached to it. And she had built it the only way anything real gets built, which is by showing up when it hurts and doing the work anyway. Her mother, Diana Hayes, 63 years old, 34 years, a school administrator, had raised Simone alone after Simone's father left when Simone was 7, and Diana had done it with the particular combination of love and practicality that produces women who do not panic. Women who assess women who understand that the world is not always fair and that understanding it is not the same as accepting it. And she had given Simone many things over the years, but the one Simone returned to most often was this: Always get the name, baby. Always get the name. Coach Marcus Okafor had been a UFC contender in his late 20s, a man who had come within one fight of a title shot and lost it to a torn ACL at 32 that ended everything in the space of a single wrong step. And he had spent every year since pouring everything he knew and everything he'd lost into fighters who still had their window open, and Simone was his best one, and he knew it, and she knew it, and the rankings knew it too. 13 wins. 2 losses, both in her first 2 professional years, before her footwork had caught up with her instincts. Then 11 straight 6 by TKO, 3 by submission, 2 by unanimous decision, the kind where all 3 judges give you every single round, and the other fighter's corner is already talking about adjustments before the final bell even sounds. She was ranked 4th nationally in the light heavyweight division, and in 5 weeks she would step into a cage in Columbus, Ohio for the title fight she had been building toward for the better part of a decade. Today was not a hard session, and it was never supposed to be. Tuesday, 5 weeks out, footwork day, light bag work, some accessory lifting, nothing heavy enough to risk injury, nothing intense enough to drain the reserves. She was carefully accumulating the way a person saves money for something they know is coming and know is going to cost everything they have. She arrived at Ironwood at 2:15, changed in the locker room with the efficiency of someone who has done this so many times. The ritual has become invisible, and walked out onto the main floor with her earbuds in and her mind already moving through the patterns she wanted to run. Her hands were chalk-dusted from the locker room routine, white against her dark skin, the marks of someone who had been working with her hands long enough that chalk was simply part of the texture of the day. Craig Dalton and Pete Garner came through the front door of Ironwood, the way certain men enter spaces they have decided belong to them, not with any announcement, not with any particular aggression, just with the ambient assumption that their presence reorganized the room's priorities, that equipment they wanted was theirs to use, that conversations they wanted to have could happen at whatever volume they chose, regardless of who else was trying to focus. Dalton was 36, broad across the shoulders, and his hands were the first thing you noticed when you looked at him up close. Large, thick-fingered, the kind of hands that had always gotten what they reached for, that had never spent much time being told no, that rested on equipment or door frames or other people's space, with the easy confidence of tools that had always found a use and expected to keep finding it. He had been with Hargrove PD for 8 years, not because he was exceptional at the work, not because the department had any particular reason to be proud of him, but because he had spent 8 years finding the precise angle from which a man can do what he wants while keeping the paperwork clean enough that no one in a position to stop him ever feels compelled to try. He had become very good at finding that angle. The angle had become his entire understanding of how the world was supposed to work. Renata Voss had her own reasons for noticing Craig Dalton the moment he walked in, reasons that had nothing to do with anything he'd done today. 4 months earlier, there had been a woman who trained at Ironwood on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Her name was Keisha. She always took the squat rack near the window. She always arrived with headphones in and left with them out. She was the kind of person who nodded at familiar faces without making them into conversations. And then one week, she simply wasn't there anymore, and the week after that, she wasn't there either. And eventually, Renata had understood that Keisha wasn't coming back. Though Renata hadn't been certain why, only that the timing of her absence had started the week Dalton came in on a Thursday morning when Keisha was alone in the free weights section. Renata had said nothing. She had told herself she didn't actually know anything. She had watched Keisha's empty spot by the window for 3 weeks and told herself this, and it had worked well enough until right now, until this particular Tuesday afternoon, when Craig Dalton walked through the door again, and Renata reached for her gym bag and made sure she knew where her phone was. The badge was clipped inside his gym bag, visible through the open flap, not because he had forgotten to put it away, but because he had never fully put it away, because he understood that the most effective display of authority is the casual one. The one that doesn't look like display, The one that simply exists in your peripheral vision and reminds you of something without making you feel like you've been reminded. Simone finished her third set of squats at 3:10 in the afternoon. Set the bar back on the rack with the controlled release of someone who has done this enough times that the movement is completely automatic. Pulled one earbud out and let it hang against her collarbone and walked toward the water fountain near the far wall. It was a 12-second walk. Unremarkable. Routine. The kind of movement a person makes 40 times in a training session without a single thought attached to it. The body simply doing what it needs to do. So the work can continue, and her mind was still on the footwork patterns she wanted to run after this on the diagonal step. Coach Marcus had been refining with her for the past month on the way the pivot sequence felt slightly different on her left side, and what that difference was telling her. Craig Dalton was coming from the opposite direction with a protein shaker in one hand and saying something to Garner over his shoulder, laughing at his own sentence before it had finished, and their paths crossed near the edge of the squat platform. What happened next was not an accident. His arm swung in a deliberate arc. His palm came down across the curve of her shorts with enough force to be unmistakable in its intention, and the sound it made cracked off the rubber mat and the metal rack behind her and reached every corner of the room before anyone had fully processed what they'd seen. The sensory detail of it was specific and lasting, the smell of rubber and chalk and someone's pre-workout supplement nearby. The low bass of the music overhead, the way the fluorescent lights made everything look equally exposed. And then the impact, and then the silence, and then Dalton's face arranging itself from a micro-expression of satisfaction into something meant to look like amusement. And it was the gap between those two expressions, that fraction of a second, that told everything there was to know about what this had been. Simone stopped walking. Every muscle in her body went still in the way that happens with elite athletes who have spent years learning to separate reaction from response, to locate the space between stimulus and action, and live in that space long enough to choose. Not frozen with shock, not rigid with anger, but coiled in the way a spring is coiled, controlled in the way that is actually the opposite of stillness, because everything inside it is in motion, just motion that has not yet decided its direction. She turned around. Renata Voss on the mat behind her gym bag reached into the side pocket and wrapped her fingers around her phone, and she kept her eyes down and she pressed record. The gym had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone is pretending not to pay attention, while paying complete attention when 20 people have collectively decided that the most important thing they can do right now is find something else to look at. And that collective decision was its own kind of statement. And Dalton read it the same way he always read it, the same way he had always read it. The same way Keisha's empty spot by the window had been read by everyone who noticed it and said nothing. Simone stood 6 feet from Craig Dalton and looked at his face with the particular quality of stillness that had made 11 consecutive opponents understand too late that they had fundamentally miscalculated something. She was not trembling. She was not blinking rapidly. Her jaw was not clenched in the visible way of someone suppressing something that wants to come out. She looked like a person who had arrived at absolute clarity about a situation that everyone else in the room was still pretending was ambiguous. "Don't put your hands on me again," she said, and her voice was level, not soft, not shouted, calibrated the way you calibrate something when you have learned that the most dangerous thing you can project in a difficult moment is complete control. Dalton blinked, and for a half-second, barely visible gone almost before it appeared, something uncertain moved across his face. The faintest flicker of a man who has encountered something that doesn't behave the way it's supposed to behave. Then it was gone, replaced by the grin, the performed grin, the one that existed for the audience and needed the audience to exist. "Whoa!" he said, stepping back in theatrical surrender, hands raised, pulling Garner into the bit the way he always did. "Attitude. Was I not being friendly?" "Very friendly," Garner confirmed, still grinning, following the lead the way he always followed it. Dalton turned back to Simone, the grin still fixed, and let his eyes travel down and back up slow, deliberate, the kind of look designed to remind a woman exactly how she is being perceived and to locate her in a particular category and make her feel the walls of it. "Dressed like that, sweetheart." He said the words coming out easy and practiced. What exactly did you expect? Some girls take it as a compliment. Simone looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she said quietly, without drama, without raising her voice the way a person states a fact they are completely certain of, "You'll find out what that means." Then she turned around and walked toward the squat platform to collect her things. Behind her, Dalton's voice lifted, emboldened by the retreat he was misreading entirely. "That's right. Walk away. Some people just can't take a joke." Gary Mullen appeared at the edge of the main floor with his clipboard and his collared shirt that said "Owner" without him ever having to say it, and he spread his hands with the particular warmth of a man trying to lower a temperature without taking a side, because taking a side would mean choosing, and choosing would mean consequences. "Let's just take 5, he said. "Get some air, everyone. It's all good in here." Simone turned and looked at him. Just looked, and Mullen stopped talking mid-sentence. "He put his hands on me, Gary," she said. Not accusatory, not pleading, a fact stated for the record. Mullen's mouth opened. "I'm sure it wasn't meant to be." "It was meant to be exactly what it was," Simone said, and the silence after that sentence was a different quality than the one before it. Heavier, more honest, the silence of a room that had been caught pretending. Simone picked up her towel from the edge of the squat platform and reached for her water bottle and began collecting her things with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who is leaving entirely on their own terms. Not being driven out, not retreating, simply completing the only transaction with this place that still mattered to her. Renata Voss on the mat behind her gym bag had not moved. Her eyes were on the floor. The lens of her phone was barely visible through the gap in the bag's open zipper, and the recording had been running since before the impact. "Yeah, that's right," Dalton said to the room, his voice lifting now that Simone was moving away, emboldened by the motion he was misreading as defeat. "Walk away. Some people just cannot take a joke, can't take a compliment. Everything's an offense these days, I guess." He shook his head with the weary performance of a man being persecuted by common decency, and a couple of people in the room nodded, not in agreement, but in the reflexive way people nod when they want a conflict to end, and nodding is the lowest cost available gesture. Simone had her bag on her shoulder. She was at the door. She stopped, did not turn around, and said to the space in front of her quietly, the way a person states a certainty, "You'll find out what that means." Then she walked out. Behind her, Dalton laughed, looked at Garner, looked at the room. "What was that supposed to mean?" He spread his hands, inviting everyone to share the joke one more time. Nobody answered. In the corner, Renata Voss pressed stop. She looked at the footage for 3 seconds. The angle was good, the audio was clear, every word audible, the badge visible in the gym bag behind him. In frame the entire time. And then she locked her phone and put it back in her bag and sat very still for a moment. And then she finished her stretching, and she completed her lifting session, and she drove home, and she made dinner, and she washed the dishes, and she sat down at her kitchen table and opened her laptop and started thinking very carefully about what to do with 47 seconds of video. The most dangerous thing in that room wasn't the woman who had just walked out. It was what was sitting in Renata Voss's phone. Simone sat in the parking lot of Ironwood Gym for 4 minutes without starting the engine, and she was not crying, and she was not shaking, and her hands on the steering wheel were perfectly steady, because Coach Marcus had spent 8 years teaching her that the most important thing you do after a difficult moment in the cage, outside the cage, anywhere, is run a clean and honest assessment of what just happened, stripped of emotion, stripped of narrative, just the bare architecture of fact laid out in order so you can see it clearly and decide what it requires. The facts were, a uniformed police officer had physically assaulted her in a public space in front of witnesses. He had displayed his badge as an implied threat when she objected. The gym owner had suggested she be the one to step back. 20 people had been present, and not one of them had spoken. She had been calm. She had not touched him. She had done nothing that could be used against her. She pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app. She typed the time, 3:22 p.m., and the date. She typed Craig Dalton because she had looked at his badge carefully, had read the name with the same deliberate attention her mother had been pressing into her since childhood. Always get the name, baby. Always. Because the name is the difference between a story someone can dismiss and a record someone has to answer. She typed his badge number. She typed a description of what had happened, precise, sequential, factual, no embellishment, because the facts required none, and then she typed the names of every person she could identify who had been present. Then she started the engine and drove directly to the Hargrove Police Department on Manning Avenue, because that was what you were supposed to do. The front desk officer was young mid-20s, sandy-haired, a name tag that read Officer T. Vance, and he looked up from his monitor when she approached and gave her the practiced, neutral expression of someone trained to appear approachable while committing as little as possible.
"I'd like to file a complaint," Simone said. "Sexual assault and intimidation by a Hargrove officer." Something moved across Vance's face, brief, almost imperceptible, and then it was gone and his hand was reaching for a form. "Craig Dalton," Simone said when he asked for the name.
She described what had happened clearly and completely, and when Vance asked whether a weapon had been involved, she said, "His hand. He struck me across the backside without consent, and then when I objected, he made sure I could see his badge." She waited 17 minutes for the supervisor. Sergeant Roy Briggs was in his 50s, gray at the temples, carrying the particular bearing of a man who had been managing paperwork for 2 decades and had gradually allowed the paperwork to become the purpose, the forms, the procedures, the time-tested architecture of institutional non-response. That looks from the outside like process and feels from the inside like disappearing. He reviewed the form, read it twice. Then he looked up at Simone over it with the measured expression of a man who has already arrived at his conclusion and is simply deciding how to present it. "Officer Dalton is an 8-year veteran of this department," Briggs said. "He has a clean record." "Does a clean record change what he did?" Simone asked. Briggs set the form down. "We take these matters seriously, but a gym environment can sometimes—" "Sergeant." Simone's voice did not rise, but it changed in texture, became something denser and more deliberate. "I am not asking you to consider context. I am asking you to accept a formal complaint from a citizen who was physically assaulted by one of your officers. That complaint is either accepted or it is not." A long pause. "We'll look into it," Briggs said, the tone of a sentence designed to close a conversation rather than begin an investigation. "I'll need a copy of the complaint with a case number and a timestamp, please," Simone said. The timestamp read 4:12 p.m. She folded the paper twice and put it in her jacket pocket and walked back out into the late afternoon sun, and she held that copy the way you hold the one piece of evidence you know you're going to need later. She sat in the driver's seat of her car in the parking lot of the Hargrove Police Department and called Diana Hayes. And Diana picked up on the second ring, the way she always picked up when it was Simone, not because Simone called often in distress, but because Diana had spent 22 years learning the specific weight of her daughter's silences and could read the difference between a call that starts easy and a call that starts with something happening inside the pause before the first word. "What happened?" Diana said, before Simone spoke. Simone told her everything: the gym, the slap, the badge left visible in the bag, Gary Mullen and his "let's take 5, the desk officer's slow typing Briggs, and his 8-year veteran with a clean record, the timestamp that felt less like documentation and more like a formality designed to become a dead end. Diana was quiet for a moment. "Baby," she said, "you sure you want to push this? These things have a way of—" "Mom."
Simone looked through the windshield at the seal above the department door, at the flag hanging still in the windless afternoon. He put his hands on me in front of 20 people, and every single one of them looked away. And then I went in there, and the sergeant read the complaint and told me about Dalton's clean record. Diana was quiet again, the longer quiet, the one that meant she was deciding not what to think, but what to say. "What do you need?" she said finally. "I need Coach Marcus," Simone said. She hung up, looked at the building. She had done what she was supposed to do, the right forms, the right channels, the right timestamp. She already knew with the clarity that comes from a lifetime of paying attention to how things actually work rather than how they are supposed to work, that it was not going to be enough. What she didn't know yet was that someone else had already decided to do something about that. On the third day after the incident, Craig Dalton heard about the complaint from Pete Garner, who had heard it from someone in the department. The way information always moved inside precincts faster than official channels, looser than policy, allowed traveling through the informal network of men who told each other things because telling each other things was how they maintained the shape of a world they had built together. Dalton laughed when Garner told him. Actually laughed the kind of laugh that is mostly reflex. Mostly the sound of a man hearing something that confirms what he already believed about the limits of other people's power over him. But the laugh had an edge to it, a tightness at the back of it, and that tightness told him what the laugh was trying not to. He went back to Ironwood that same afternoon. He found Gary Mullen in the small office behind the front desk, and he closed the door behind him, which was something he had never done before, and that single gesture, the soft click of the latch, the sudden privacy of it, said more than anything that followed. He wasn't angry. He was conversational, almost amused if you didn't listen too carefully to the undertone. "Your girl filed a report on me," he said. Gary Mullen had been dreading this conversation since the moment Simone walked out the door 3 days ago. He was a man who had built an identity around being liked, around being the gym where everyone felt welcome, and he had never fully examined the degree to which maintaining that identity sometimes required making certain people feel less welcome than others. Dalton talked about the gym, about the neighborhood, about community, about the kind of place Ironwood had always been, a family place, a safe place, a place where people came because they trusted it, and about the people who kept it safe, and about what it meant to be part of something like that, and about how important it was for everyone involved to remember what kind of community this was and who kept it together. He never made a direct threat. He was very good at not making direct threats. He left without buying anything, no protein bar, no water, no upgrade to his membership, and that detail, small and specific, said everything the conversation had been careful not to say. He had not come as a customer. He had come to collect. That evening, Gary Mullen called Simone's cell phone. 3 months free membership, Gary said, and we can just put this. Gary. Simone said, her voice quiet. I've been a member here for 8 years. I've never once asked you for anything free. I'm asking you now for one thing: only tell the truth about what you saw, that's all. The silence on Gary's end lasted long enough that she could hear the television playing in whatever room he was sitting in. Some laugh track, cycling through the quiet house of a man discovering that choosing not to choose is still a choice, and that the bill for that particular choice had simply been deferred. I don't want any trouble, Simone, he said. I've got a business to run. She hung up, sat on the edge of her bed, and understood completely exactly what her mother's unfinished sentence had always contained. Simone's phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't have saved. My name is Renata. We go to the same gym. I have something you need to see. Can we talk? She stared at the message for a long moment, long enough to run through the realistic possibilities, to assess, to feel the specific quality of hope that comes wrapped in caution, because hope without caution has cost people she knew more than they could afford to lose. Then she typed, when.
She set the phone down and looked at the ceiling of her apartment, and she thought about what it means to do everything right. The form, the timestamp, the copy. The call to her mother, the facts laid out clean and sequential, and still feel the ground shifting underneath the process. The complaint portal on the city's website read, "Status under review," the two most carefully chosen non-committal words in the English language. Sergeant Briggs had not followed up. Gary Mullen wanted to buy her silence with 3 months of free barbells. But a woman she had never really spoken to, a woman whose name she hadn't known until 10 minutes ago, had been in that room with a phone in her hand. Sometimes in Simone's experience, one person is the entire difference between a story that disappears and a record that doesn't. They met at a coffee shop on Mercer Street at 8 o'clock the following morning, and Renata arrived first, already seated, when Simone walked in, laptop open on the table, a coffee in front of her that she hadn't touched, looking like someone who had not slept well and had decided that being useful was a reasonable substitute. 2 years of shared gym time, and they had never had a real conversation. Nods of recognition, the occasional comment about equipment being free, nothing more than the ambient acknowledgement of people who share a space without sharing a life. And now, Renata slid the laptop across the table, without preamble. The way you offer something to someone when you have been waiting days to offer it and small talk feels obscene. "I started recording before he touched you," she said. "I had been watching him for about 10 minutes the way he was tracking you when you were at the bag. I just had a feeling." Simone looked at the screen. The footage was 47 seconds long, beginning with a clear, stable shot of the gym floor. Renata's bag in the foreground, everything beyond it in crisp focus. You could see Simone walking back from the water fountain. You could see Dalton approaching from the opposite direction. And you could see in the moment before impact the deliberate arc of his arm, the satisfied micro-expression that crossed his face a fraction of a second before it arranged itself into amusement. The landing of his palm, and then the grin, and then the words, and then the badge visible in the open gym bag behind him, sitting in the frame the entire time like a piece of evidence waiting to be called by its proper name. The audio was clear. Every word. Simone watched the 47 seconds, once completely still. Then she watched them again. The same stillness, not passive, not numb, but the gathered stillness of someone collecting everything available before deciding what to do with it. "This is clear," she said. "I've watched it probably 30 times, Renata said. "There's no angle where it looks like something else." Simone straightened in her chair. "What do you want to do with it?" Renata wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I want to do what's right," she said. "I've been sitting with this for 4 days trying to figure out the safest way to do that because I know there are risks for both of us, and I wanted to ask you first because it's your story, not mine." Simone thought about the spinning wheel on the complaint portal. She thought about Briggs's voice saying "clean record" like it was an answer to a different question than the one she'd asked. She thought about Gary Mullen's television playing in the background while he offered her 3 months of free membership in exchange for her silence. "Send it to me," she said. "And then I need to make a phone call." The complaint portal showed a spinning wheel for approximately 40 seconds each time Simone loaded it before displaying the words "Status under review" in the same mild gray font the city apparently used for all information it intended to communicate without actually saying anything. She checked it every morning. Every morning it said the same thing, the same 2 words. Spinning wheel, then those 2 words as reliable as a door that leads nowhere. On the 4th day, she called the department directly and asked for Sergeant Briggs. Briggs was unavailable. She left her name and number. He did not call back. She called again that afternoon and reached a different officer who explained with the rehearsed patience of someone reading from a script they had read many times before that complaints involving sworn personnel were subject to a review process that could take up to 30 business days. 30 business days. 6 weeks. the same amount of time she had until her title fight. She called Coach Marcus and told him what they'd said, and Marcus was quiet for a moment in the particular way of a man who is not surprised and who is deciding whether the moment calls for honesty or comfort, choosing honesty because he had always believed honesty in the long run was the only thing that actually helped. 30 days, he said. Then I'm going to make some calls. Marcus Okafor spent the following morning working through every contact he had accumulated in 20 years of professional fighting and training. A former fighter turned city councilman, a retired detective he had trained alongside at Ironwood years before the department's community liaison office. Every legitimate channel he could think of, every door that was supposed to be open to a citizen with a documented complaint and a recording and a timeline that didn't add up. The community liaison officer was sympathetic, genuinely it seemed, and she took notes and said she would follow up internally, and said it with the same practiced gravity that Briggs had used, the same tone that sounded like beginning and functioned like ending. Marcus called the police union's public representative and asked simply and specifically where a civilian could direct concerns about how a complaint against an officer was being handled, not about discipline, not about consequences, just about process. The union rep's tone changed the moment he heard Dalton's name, the shift in register that happens when a person stops talking to you and starts talking at you when the conversation stops being a conversation and becomes a position paper. Officer Dalton is a dues-paying member of this union, the rep said. Any complaint filed against him is subject to union review before any disciplinary action can be. I didn't ask about disciplinary action, Marcus said. I asked about the complaint process. The rep repeated what he had just said in slightly different words. Marcus thanked him and hung up. He sat at the desk in the back office of his training facility and stared at the wall for a long moment, the particular weight of recognition rather than surprise. He had grown up in Hargrove, had been stopped 5 times in his 20s for driving through the wrong neighborhoods at the wrong hours. He was not shocked. He was the specific kind of tired that comes not from encountering something unexpected, but from encountering once again something he had always known was there. He called Simone. The system is doing what it does, he said. We need to think about what else we have. What they didn't know was that across town, something was already moving on its own. Dana Whitfield was 24 years old, and she had worked as a civilian records coordinator at the Hargrove Police Department for 2 years before she transferred to a different precinct 7 months ago, and she had never told anyone the specific reason she transferred, only that she had decided she needed a change, which was true in the way that a symptom is true, accurate, and visible, but not the whole story. She heard about Simone's complaint the way civilian employees of the department heard about everything through the informal network that ran alongside the official one, faster and looser, and far more complete in its accounting of what was actually happening versus what was being put on paper. She was sitting in her apartment on the 4th floor of a building on Clement Avenue when she read the name Craig Dalton, and something happened inside her chest that she had learned in the past 7 months to recognize as the body's way of telling you that you have been carrying something alone for longer than it can be carried. 14 months ago, Dalton had come to the department fitness facility on a morning when Dana was there alone. He was not in uniform. What happened was not identical to what happened at Ironwood. It was not a slap. It was not performed for an audience, but it came from the same place, the same fundamental certainty that his comfort and his curiosity and his assessment of the situation took precedence over her clearly stated no, and she had left that morning feeling shaken in the specific way of someone who has just discovered that a space they believed was safe is not. She told her supervisor informally 3 days later in the hallway outside the records room as briefly and carefully as she could manage. Her supervisor listened. Then he said, "Think carefully about what you're alleging." She had thought carefully. 3 days of careful thought, at the end of which she had decided that she must have misread things, that she had been too sensitive, that the cost of being wrong was higher than the cost of staying quiet. and she had withdrawn what wasn't quite a complaint and had tried to put it somewhere. She didn't have to look at it, and she had transferred precincts 4 months later when looking at it became part of going to work. Now she opened her laptop. She didn't know exactly where to send what she was feeling. She only knew that a woman named Simone Hayes had done what Dana had decided was too costly to do and had gone through the process Dana had been told to think carefully about, and that the process had done to Simone exactly what Dana had feared it would do to her. She started writing. She didn't know yet where it would go. She only knew she couldn't stay quiet again. Coach Marcus had covered his contacts inside the system and found them all locked or laced with the particular friction of institutional self-protection. And he had one more number in his phone, a number he had been saving for a situation that required it. Kevin Strand was an investigative journalist at the Hargrove Tribune who had covered Simone's last 3 professional fights, and who had a reputation for following stories into places that made institutions uncomfortable. Methodical patient. The kind of reporter who could spend 4 months on a single story before a single editor would run it, and when they finally ran it, it would be airtight, every claim sourced, every source on record. Marcus explained the situation in 4 sentences. Strand said, "Send me the footage. I'll call you in an hour." He called back in 40 minutes. "I want to tell this story," he said, "but I need 24 hours. I'm pulling Dalton's public record first." What Strand found when he started pulling took him longer than he expected, not because the information was hidden, but because there was more of it than he had anticipated, and because the more he found, the more clearly a pattern assembled itself. Not the pattern of one bad afternoon in a gym, but the pattern of something that had been happening long enough to develop its own infrastructure of concealment. 2 prior complaints filed against Dalton, both originating from the department's own fitness facility, both subsequently withdrawn. One of the complainants was a civilian employee named Dana Whitfield, who had transferred to a different precinct 7 months after filing. The other complainant had stopped working for the city altogether. Strand documented everything with the methodical patience of a man who had learned that the story is always in the paper trail. But it was the timestamp on Simone's complaint that stopped him when he got to it, 4:12 p.m. on a Tuesday, received at the front desk, logged by Officer Vance, and next to it in the system marked resolved at 2:09 p.m. on the following Wednesday. 22 hours, including overnight hours when the office was unstaffed. Not a review process, a disposal dressed up as a determination, a conclusion pretending to be a process. He picked up the phone and called Marcus back. "I have everything I need," he said. "Give me until tomorrow afternoon." The article went live at 3:15 in the afternoon, and the headline read, "Video evidence shows Hargrove officer assaulting woman at local gym complaint, filed, no action taken." Within 4 hours, it had been viewed 2.3 million times, the 47 seconds of Renata's footage embedded directly below the headline, loading instantly on every platform that carried it. The sound of Dalton's hand, and his voice and his grin traveling through 11 million phones before midnight, in the specific pattern that happens when outrage and admiration arrive at the same moment in the same story. Within 6 hours, someone had searched Simone Hayes' name and found her professional record, 13 wins, 2 losses, ranked 4th nationally. Title fight in 5 weeks, and the story doubled and then tripled, the shares cascading across platforms, the clip living in pockets and on screens and in conversations in 22 states by morning. By the time the sun came up, hashtag Simone Hayes was trending, and the 47 seconds Renata Voss had recorded from behind her gym bag had become one of the most watched clips of the year. Sitting in her apartment 2 miles from the precinct, Simone read the article at her kitchen table at 6 in the morning, her coffee going cold beside her phone. She read it once, then set the phone face down on the table and sat for a long moment in the quiet of the early morning, and then she picked up the phone again and typed a message to Coach Marcus. "I saw it. I'm going to train this morning. Don't call me until afternoon." Then she drove to the gym and worked because the work was the only response she had ever fully trusted. Not the platform, not the attention, but the daily accumulation of preparation for something real. Captain Louise Mercer had been with the Hargrove Police Department for 22 years, and she had made every step of that career on the basis of work that could not be argued with, and documentation that could not be questioned, and a standard she held herself to, that she had never once lowered regardless of what she observed others getting away with around her. She had made detective at 29, lieutenant at 37, captain at 45, each step taken without a mentor who looked like her, without anyone at the top of the ladder who reached back down to pull her forward, each step earned in the specific way that things get earned, when you do not have access to the informal networks that make earning unnecessary for other people. She knew what a buried complaint looked like. She recognized the fingerprints of institutional self-protection, the vague timestamps, the absence of follow-up documentation, the case status that read under review and stayed there until the complainant gave up or the news cycle moved on, and she recognized them because she had spent 22 years watching them accumulate, watching the institution protect itself at the expense of the people it was supposed to serve. She pulled Dalton's full file at 7:45 in the morning and read every page by 8:30, and she found it on page 17, a single document filed by Dalton himself in the 48 hours following Simone's complaint, characterizing Simone's behavior in the gym as aggressive and non-compliant, using the language of a police report to retroactively construct a record that didn't match any account of the event, except his own designed to sit in the file and do work on his behalf in any future proceeding. She flagged it. She said nothing about it to anyone. She put it in her folder and waited. At 9 o'clock, Sergeant Roy Briggs was sitting across from her desk. She asked him about the Carter complaint, deliberately using the wrong name, watching his face to see whether he would correct her. He didn't. She walked him through it. Question by question. Did you speak formally with Officer Dalton? Did you take a written statement? Did you contact the complainant to inform her of any determination and the silences that followed? Each question grew progressively longer. The silences of a man who has been doing something by habit for so long that he has stopped noticing it's a thing he does until someone makes him name it in sequential order in a room with the door closed.
This complaint was received at 4:12 p.m. on a Tuesday, Mercer said, placing the timeline in front of him. It was marked resolved at 2:09 p.m. on the following Wednesday. That includes overnight hours when this office is not staffed. She let that sit. That is not a review process, Sergeant. That is a disposal.
By noon, she had opened a formal internal affairs investigation. The union rep called her office 17 minutes after the paperwork was filed. She let it go to voicemail. He called again. She picked up, listened to 45 seconds of procedural objection, and said, "The video is in 11 million phones. We are past the point where process is a shield." Then she hung up. The union attorney thought the radio interview was a good idea, and Dalton thought the union attorney was right, and neither of them had fully absorbed what 47 seconds of clear audio and video in 11 million phones actually meant for the viability of a misunderstanding narrative. Dalton spoke for 4 minutes on the morning drive program Locker Room Humor, he said. Overreaction, a good officer's record being smeared over nothing. The host waited until he finished. "I want to play something for our listeners," the host said. He played 11 seconds of the clip, the impact, the grin, the voice, saying some girls take it as a compliment, and then he let 7 seconds of dead air sit on the broadcast. 7 seconds of nothing. On radio, that is an eternity, and every listener would remember it precisely because it contained so much. "Officer Dalton," the host said carefully, "I've watched this footage 3 times this morning. I want to give you one final opportunity to explain what I'm seeing." 4 seconds of silence on the line. 5, 6. The call disconnected. The host looked at his board. "He hung up," he said to his listeners with the quiet disbelief of a man watching something confirm exactly what he suspected. But Dalton did not go home and reflect. That was the thing about men like him. The moment the pressure increased, the instinct was not to retreat, but to reassert, to find the nearest available space where they still felt like the authority, the dominant presence, the one who defined the terms. 2 hours after the radio interview ended, Dalton walked back into Ironwood Gym. He was not in uniform. He was in workout clothes, his gym bag over one shoulder badge clipped inside the open flap exactly where it always was. He moved through the main floor as if nothing had changed, as if 11 million people hadn't watched 47 seconds of him that morning, loading a barbell at the rack nearest the squat platform, the same rack where Simone had been working when their paths crossed 3 days ago. Garner came in 15 minutes later, and they trained loudly, the way they always trained. Equipment left loaded between sets, conversations at full volume. The ambient broadcast of men who believe their comfort is the room's default setting. Near the end of their session, a young woman, mid-20s, training alone in the corner, walked past Dalton's bench on her way to the water fountain. Dalton said something to her low, just loud enough that she could hear and no one else clearly could, and she walked faster, and she did not turn around, and she kept her eyes straight ahead all the way to the fountain and all the way back. And when she passed his bench again, she gave it a wide berth, 3 extra feet of distance between herself and it, the specific body language of someone who has just learned which spaces in a room are not safe. Dalton watched her pass and said something else quieter this time, just to Garner, and Garner laughed. Nobody in the gym said anything. Renata Voss was not there to record it this time. But a teenage boy doing pull-ups near the far wall had been watching the whole thing, and he pulled out his phone and he called his mother, and his mother called Kevin Strand, and Strand arrived at the gym 20 minutes after Dalton had left and spent 45 minutes taking statements from 3 separate witnesses who had been present. The false victory was complete. Dalton had walked back into the room, reasserted his authority, made another person feel unsafe, and left convinced that nothing had changed, and nothing was going to change. He was exactly where men like him always ended up, so certain they were untouchable that they kept doing the thing right up until the moment the floor gave way beneath them. 3 other women came forward, and they came forward the way people do when they have been waiting for something without knowing exactly what they were waiting for, quietly, individually, through different channels, each one having watched the clip and recognized something in it that she had spent months or years telling herself was not what it looked like. Christine had filed an informal complaint with a supervisor 16 months ago after an encounter with Dalton at a department community event. She had been told to think carefully about what she was alleging. She had thought carefully, withdrawn the complaint, and transferred teams. Patrice had said nothing to anyone, not a supervisor, not a colleague, not a friend. She had transferred departments and tried to forget, and she had been largely successful until the moment she watched 47 seconds of footage and understood with sudden absolute clarity that she had not misread anything. Dana Whitfield called the department's newly activated tip line at 2:17 in the afternoon and gave a statement for the first time. The first time she had spoken on record about anything that had happened to her. The first time she had put her name next to the story she had been carrying alone for 14 months. Her words were precise and unadorned, the words of someone who is not performing anything, who is simply reporting what happened. I told my supervisor informally. I was told to think carefully about what I was alleging. I thought about it for 3 days. I decided I must have misread things. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. A pause. It was a big deal. I just didn't have anyone telling me that yet. Kevin Strand made the introduction, and they met at a community center conference room that Coach Marcus had access to, neutral ground. Quiet, no cameras, no press, nothing public about any of it. Dana arrived first, small and careful in her movements, with the posture of someone who has been making herself inconspicuous for so long that it has become structural. And she stood when Simone walked in and immediately looked like she didn't know what to do with her hands. Simone walked directly across the room and put her arms around her. Dana stood very still for a moment, a fraction of a second, maybe 2, and then her shoulders dropped approximately 2 inches, the specific physical release of someone who has been holding something rigid and has finally found a safe enough moment to let it go, and she hugged back. They talked for an hour, not about strategy or timelines or what came next, but about what it felt like to name a thing and have the room tell you it wasn't what you said it was. About the specific exhaustion of deciding over and over again whether the cost of speaking was worth it. About the moment you realize the answer is yes, not because the cost has gone down, but because staying quiet has a cost too, and you have finally added it up honestly, and the sum is not what you were told it would be. When Dana left, she looked different in a way that was difficult to name precisely but impossible to miss. Not fixed, not healed, but held like someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has finally set it down long enough to feel its actual weight, and has found in the feeling of it something unexpected, that it has edges, that it is a thing and not everything. Simone drove back to the gym and went back to work. The formal audit of Sergeant Roy Briggs's complaint handling practices over the preceding 3 years was ordered by Captain Mercer within 48 hours of the internal affairs investigation being opened, conducted by a team that reported directly to her and not to anyone who had ever shared a break room with Briggs. The audit found 11 complaints marked resolved with no documented action, no formal statements taken, no determinations recorded, no notifications sent to complainants. 7 of those 11 complaints involved the same 2 or 3 officers filed by different people in different years, each one handled with the same efficient invisibility that left no evidence of wrongdoing precisely because it left no evidence of anything at all. Briggs's handling of Simone's complaint was not an outlier. It was a method refined over years into something so practiced and smooth that it had long since stopped looking like a choice and had started looking like the way things simply were. Lieutenant Wade, who had waved through Dalton's prior informal reports with the bureaucratic indifference of a man who had stopped reading what he signed, was called into Mercer's office on the 3rd day of the investigation. He emerged 40 minutes later looking like a man who had just been shown a clear accounting of something he had long been telling himself he wasn't responsible for. He submitted a written statement cooperating fully, the statement of a man who has looked at what's coming and understood that cooperation is the only available path that doesn't lead somewhere worse. Gary Mullen finally released a public statement, 3 carefully constructed paragraphs drafted. It was obvious by someone with a legal background, using phrases like, "We take all concerns seriously," and committed to fostering an inclusive environment and reviewing our policies and procedures. The language designed to create the appearance of accountability without the substance of it. It did not say, "I watched it happen," and then told her to take a break. It did not say, "He came to my office 3 days later and I agreed to handle my member." It said nothing that was actually true about what Gary Mullen had done. Simone responded with 1 sentence posted to her public account at 9:47 in the morning. "He watched it happen and then asked me to reconsider my complaint." That is his statement. The sentence was shared 400,000 times before noon. Ironwood Gym lost 40% of its female memberships in 7 days. Not all at once, not coordinated, just the individual decisions of individual women who had read Gary's statement and recognized in it something they had seen in other rooms, other institutions, other moments when someone with standing had decided that managing the situation was more important than doing what was right. 2 corporate sponsors quietly withdrew from the gym's annual fitness competition events. A women's boxing club that had been using the facility for weekend classes gave notice and relocated. Gary Mullen sat in his small office behind the front desk and watched the bookings drop on his scheduling software with the expression of a man finally understanding that inaction is also a choice, and that the consequence of his particular choice had been delayed but not canceled. Strand published his second piece 36 hours after the first, and he had spent all of those hours on it in the focused way of a reporter who understands he is inside a story that will matter long after the news cycle moves on. The headline read, "Pattern of Silence: How Hargrove PD Buried 3 Complaints Against Officer Craig Dalton." 4,000 words, dated and sourced, and specific case numbers and supervisor names and procedural requirements. The department's own written policies set against the documented evidence of how those policies had been applied in practice. Dana Whitfield's statement appeared in full the first time she had spoken on record, her words given their full length and weight without summary or reduction, because Strand understood that summaries do a particular kind of damage to the testimony of people who have spent a long time waiting for someone to take their account seriously. And alongside Dana's statement, Strand documented what he had witnessed at Ironwood 2 days earlier. The second visit, the young woman walking faster past Dalton's bench, the wide berth she had given it on the way back, the statements from 3 witnesses who had been present. Dalton had walked back into the space after 11 million people had watched 47 seconds of him, and he had kept doing exactly what he had always done because the silence of a room had always been enough permission, and he had not yet understood that this particular room had run out of silence. Simone read the article at 6:15 in the morning at her kitchen table, read Dana's words twice, set her phone down and looked at the wall for a long, still moment. Then she picked it up and called Strand directly. "I want to meet her," she said. "Not for press. I just want her to know she's not alone." Simone's promoter had called in the first 48 hours with the careful voice of someone managing a risk assessment. "Is this going to be a distraction?" By the end of the first week, the same voice was calling with a completely different question because the title fight had become the most talked about event on the upcoming calendar ticket. Pre-sales had tripled. Broadcast interest had doubled, and the narrative had taken on a shape that no promoter could have manufactured because it was simply true. A woman had been violated, dismissed, and ignored by the process designed to protect her, and she was walking into a national title fight 5 weeks later with her dignity not just intact, but on full public display. And the combination of those two things, the injustice and the response to it, had reached people in a way that pure sports stories rarely do. Coach Marcus watched all of it from the training facility and said very little publicly. Privately, in the quiet space between sessions when it was just the two of them and the rhythm of the work, he told Simone, "You didn't ask for this fight, but you're winning it the right way." Simone finished wrapping her hands. "I win all of them the right way," she said. "That was never going to change." Then she stepped onto the mat and went back to work. The disciplinary hearing was held on a Thursday morning in a conference room on the second floor of the Hargrove Municipal Building, not a public proceeding, not televised. The attendees were the city's police oversight board, chaired by Patricia Huang, who had served on the board for 11 years and ran proceedings with the precise efficiency of someone who does not confuse thoroughness with slowness. 2 state investigators brought in at Mercer's request, Dalton's union attorney, a representative from the state attorney's office, and Craig Dalton himself. Dalton arrived in his dress uniform. His attorney had advised it. Dalton wore it with the careful bearing of a man who had been told that appearance mattered, and who had not yet understood that appearance was the one thing in this room that could no longer help him, that the 47 seconds and the paper trail and the 3 women who had come forward and the audit that had found 11 buried complaints and the witness statements from Ironwood 2 days earlier had collectively exceeded the load-bearing capacity of any appearance he could construct. Captain Louise Mercer sat across the table with one folder in front of her. She did not open it during the proceedings. She did not need to. She had read everything in it until she knew it, the way she knew her own address. Not because she needed to perform mastery, but because the information had become part of her thinking, had become the architecture of what she was about to do. Renata Voss was not in the room. Simone Hayes was not in the room. But 47 seconds of footage and 8 years of discipline, and one woman's decision to press record rather than look away. All of it was present, assembled in the specific irrefutable way that things become irrefutable when someone does the work of gathering them. The night before the hearing, Strand published a third piece. The complaint timeline in full from 4:12 p.m. Tuesday to 2:09 p.m. Wednesday, set against the department's own written policy requirements for complaint investigation line by line, each requirement followed by the documented evidence of what had actually been done in response to it. Alongside it, Dalton's false police report, the document characterizing Simone as aggressive and non-compliant, reproduced in full beneath a still frame from Renata's footage showing the moment of impact, the badge visible in the background, the grin already forming. And beneath that, the witness statements from Dalton's second visit to Ironwood. The young woman who had walked faster. The 3-foot berth she had given the bench on the way back. The names and statements of 3 witnesses. The combination, the video. The audit trail. The false report. The second visit closed. The last remaining gap in the public record left no remaining purchase for an interpretation that led anywhere except where the evidence led. By the morning of the hearing, the City Council had issued a statement. The State Attorney General's office had issued a statement. 2 federal representatives had issued statements, and Captain Louise Mercer had arrived at the municipal building at 7:30 in the morning, an hour before proceedings were scheduled to begin, and had sat alone in the empty conference room with her one folder on the table in front of her, and thought about 22 years of doing this work, about what it had cost and what it had been worth, and found sitting in that quiet room that she was ready. The hearing began at 9 o'clock with Patricia Huang establishing the formal record, and then she nodded to the state investigator, and the footage was played on a screen at the end of the conference table. 47 seconds. The room was very quiet during the viewing, not the performed quiet of people trying to appear composed, but the actual quiet of people watching something that does not require commentary, that makes commentary feel beside the point. The sound of the impact. The grin. The voice saying some girls take it as a compliment. The badge sitting in the open gym bag, visible in frame the entire time, never moved, never hidden, present through every second of the footage like a caption that wrote itself. Craig Dalton looked at the table in front of him rather than the screen. His attorney looked at the screen with an expression of careful neutrality that did not quite hold at the edges. When the clip ended, Huang looked at Dalton. Officer Dalton, before we proceed, is there any aspect of what we just viewed that you would characterize as inaccurate or incomplete? The attorney leaned forward. My client acknowledges that the contact occurred, and that in hindsight, I'd like Officer Dalton to answer, Huang said pleasantly. The pleasant tone of someone who has been doing this for 11 years and has learned that pleasantness is the most efficient container for absolute firmness. Dalton's jaw moved once before words came. The intent was not to... Was that you in the footage? Yes. Was that your hand? A pause brief, but not brief enough to be invisible. Yes. Did anyone ask you to touch them? And here the silence arrived. The silence that was the center of everything, that contained the entire weight of the case in its duration, a silence long enough that one of the state investigators shifted in his chair. The specific discomfort of a person sitting inside a question that has only one honest answer, and watching someone search for a different one. This was the freeze moment, layered and absolute. On the surface, a conference room, a table, a man in a dress uniform looking at the table in front of him rather than the face of the woman asking him a question that should take no time at all to answer. Underneath that, in the space behind his eyes, the gym floor on a Tuesday afternoon, the way the silence of 20 people had filled the room after the sound of his hand, the way he had read that silence as permission had gathered it up and used it as evidence that what he was doing was fine. And then the radio studio 2 days later. 11 seconds of his own voice played back to him, and 7 seconds of dead air, and then Ironwood again. The second visit moving through the space like nothing had changed, like the room still said what it had always said. He had been reading permission in silences for 8 years. He had never once considered what would happen when the silence ran out, and on the other side of that memory returned to the present one word. No, Dalton said. State Investigator Collins looked up from her notes. He sexually assaulted a woman in a public space. She said the words measured and deliberate, then returned to that same space 2 days later and made another woman afraid to walk past him, and he displayed his badge as an implied threat when the first woman objected. She set her pen down. Let's use accurate language. It helps everyone. Then Huang turned to face the screen. She picked up the remote. She pressed play. The clip ran again, but this time she paused it at the exact moment the words left his mouth, and she read them aloud into the record slowly, the way you read something aloud when you need it to exist permanently in a document. Some girls take it as a compliment. She set the remote down. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room that hadn't decided what to do. It was the silence of a room that had already decided and was simply giving the words their proper weight before moving forward. Dalton looked at the table. There was no Garner to laugh. There was no audience to pull into the bit. There was no room full of people who had somewhere else to look. There was only his voice played back in a space that would not accommodate the performance it had been designed for. The hearing moved through the documentation with the deliberate patience of a process that has decided it is not going to be rushed. The complaint? The 22-hour disposal. The complete absence of any formal statement from Dalton. The complete absence of any notification to the complainant. Briggs's role. The 2 prior complaints. The pattern, the audit, had found the witness statements from Ironwood. And then Patricia Huang opened the folder in front of her and said, I'm going to read Dana Whitfield's written statement into the record. In full. She read it without summary, without compression, without editorial commentary of any kind. Every word given its full weight in the room the way a person's account deserves to be given its full weight when it has spent over a year being denied that weight entirely. I told my supervisor informally. I was told to think carefully about what I was alleging. I thought about it for 3 days. I decided I must have misread things. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Huang paused at the place in the statement where Donna had paused, preserving the silence exactly as it had existed in the original telling. It was a big deal. I just didn't have anyone telling me that yet. Dalton's posture changed during the reading in a way that was subtle enough to be deniable and clear enough to be unmistakable. A slight rounding of the shoulders, a settling of something that had been held upright by habit for a very long time, and that was no longer finding the energy to stay upright, a small and visible collapse of the architecture of a man who has spent years building a certain story about himself and is watching in real time as the evidence for that story is removed piece by piece, until what remains is only the other story, the one other people have been trying to tell for years, sitting in the room with him, patient and precise. By the time the statement ended, Dalton looked like a significantly smaller person than the one who had walked into this room in his dress uniform 90 minutes ago. The attorney's procedural arguments were addressed and set aside. The footage existed. The prior complaints existed. The documented disposal of those complaints existed. The second visit witness statements existed. The false report existed. These were not matters of interpretation, they were matters of record, and the record said what it said. The board deliberated for 40 minutes, and when they returned, Patricia Huang read the findings without preamble in the flat, precise tone of someone delivering a document rather than an opinion. Termination effective immediately. Referral to the state attorney's office for criminal charges, sexual assault, official misconduct, and the filing of a false police report. The document Dalton had submitted, characterizing Simone as aggressive and non-compliant, which Captain Mercer had flagged on the first day she opened the file, which had been sitting in her folder patient as everything else waiting for this moment. And then Huang added, The board further recommends that Officer Peter Garner present during the incident documented as actively encouraging the conduct be referred to the department's Professional Standards Division for formal review and termination proceedings. Garner, sitting at the back of the room in civilian clothes, went very still. Dalton said in the silence that followed the termination, "You're arresting me." Not quite a question. The grammar of it collapsed somewhere between disbelief and statement. "I'm an officer." Captain Louise Mercer spoke for the first time since the hearing had begun. Her voice was even and without heat, which was somehow more final than anger would have been. Anger implies something could still be argued with, that the temperature might be a factor, that the outcome is still in motion. This voice had already arrived somewhere. "You were an officer," she said. She looked at him across the table with the specific quality of attention of a woman who has spent 22 years watching institutions protect themselves at the expense of the people they were supposed to serve, and who is now sitting in the exact position that protection was designed to prevent her from reaching, and who is going to use it. "You used the authority of that position to make a woman feel like she had no recourse," she said. "You used it to make the people in that room feel like looking away was the safe choice. You went back to that room 2 days later and made another woman afraid to walk past you because the silence had always been enough and you expected it to keep being enough. And when the first woman refused to disappear, you filed a false report in her name, put words on paper that described her in ways designed to make anyone who read that file doubt her account before they ever heard it." She paused. "That is not what this job is. It was never what this job was." She stood, gathered the single folder. "I've been doing this work for 22 years. She said, not to Dalton specifically, but to the room, to whatever the room would carry forward from this moment. "I have watched people protect the institution at the expense of the people the institution exists to serve, and every single time, without exception, the institution paid more in the end than it would have if someone had simply done the right thing on day one." She walked to the door. 2 state officers entered behind her. Dalton looked at the handcuffs in one officer's hand. The same tool, the same cold metal, the same small mechanical click that he had heard hundreds of times in his 8 years, and that had always meant something was being controlled, something was being contained. And he went completely still, the way people go, still when they understand, finally and without any remaining ambiguity that the thing being contained is them. The officer reached for Dalton's wrists, those large, thick-fingered hands that had crossed a gym floor on a Tuesday afternoon, as if nothing in the world could stop them, as if the space and every person in it existed for their use, and the cuffs locked. The ratchet tightened and the sound of it echoed in the conference room, and then was over. The media cameras had gathered at the exit of the municipal building, and they were there when Craig Dalton emerged between 2 state officers, head angled down, shoulders collapsed inward, dress uniform. Now a costume that no longer fit the performance it had been designed for. That had been designed for a man with authority, and now sat on a man with a hearing scheduled in the state court system, and a record that said something very different than clean. The camera flashes came in waves as he crossed the parking lot, and the man who had grinned at Simone Hayes over the sound of his own hand walked through them without looking up, and the distance from the door to the vehicle was not very long, but it was long enough. 3 blocks away, Simone sat in her car and received the call from Coach Marcus. She listened, said nothing for a moment. Then, okay. She started the engine, drove back to the gym, changed her clothes, wrapped her hands, walked out onto the training floor, and finished the session. She had started on a Tuesday afternoon when a man had decided she was there for his entertainment. Every set, every round, every rep completed in the same order, she had planned them with the same attention she brought to everything she built. Then she went home and slept the deep, clean sleep of someone who has nothing left to prove. The nationwide arena in Columbus held 12,000 people, and every seat was filled on the night Simone Hayes walked out of the tunnel at 9:47 p.m. and the sound that met her was the kind of sound that arrives in the chest before the ears have finished processing it. A wall of noise rolling through the arena in waves and not stopping, building on itself, saying something that no individual voice in the building could have said alone. She wore black trunks and a black sports bra, the color she had chosen at 19, because she liked how they looked and had never encountered a reason to change them. And her hair was pulled back tight, and her hands were wrapped beneath her gloves, and her face carried the expression that the people who knew her best recognized as her most dangerous state. Not anger, not aggression, but the absolute settled calm of a person who has already decided how this ends and is simply waiting for the moment to arrive. Coach Marcus walked 2 steps behind her, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder as they reached the cage door, one moment of contact brief and complete, containing everything he would have said if saying it had been necessary. And then she stepped through and he stayed outside, and she was in the cage, and it was time. In the front row, 3 seats from the aisle, Dana Whitfield sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the tunnel Simone had just emerged from. Simone's team had sent the ticket with a handwritten note. "You said something when it mattered. Come watch." Dana had almost not come old habits of making herself inconspicuous in rooms that felt large, but she had come, and she sat straight in her seat and watched the cage door close. 2 rows behind her, Renata Voss had her phone in her hand, not to record, just to hold the way people hold things when they are feeling something too large to find another container for. Simone had called her personally. "You didn't have to pull out your phone. You did it anyway. I want you to see what it led to." In a private box above the floor, Diana Hayes watched her daughter step through the cage door with her hands clasped in her lap and her chin lifted slightly, the posture of a woman who has been proud for a very long time and has learned to carry it quietly, to hold it in the body rather than the voice. The fight lasted 3 rounds. And it was not close, the kind of performance that happens when an athlete arrives at a moment with every technical skill fully sharpened and absolutely nothing left to prove, and therefore nothing holding her back from simply being what she is. Simone moved through the first round with the footwork precision she had been drilling for 8 years. The diagonal step, the pivot sequences, the geometry of positioning that Marcus had built into her muscle memory, until it lived below conscious thought, until it was simply what her body did when her body needed to move. Her opponent was good. Simone was better. The TKO came 1 minute and 40 seconds into the 3rd round, the referee stepping in, and the arena made a sound that had no adequate description. Simone stood in the center of the cage with her arms at her sides, not raised, not performed. And she stood still for 3 seconds with her eyes closed and let the noise wash over her the way you let something wash over you when you have been waiting for it for a very long time and want to feel all of it. Then she opened her eyes and went to check on her opponent, because that was the kind of fighter she had always been. And nothing. Not a slap in a gym, not a buried complaint. Not 20 people who looked away had changed that, and nothing was going to. The post-fight interview happened in the cage broadcaster Ron Haskins, holding the microphone out, with the careful reverence of someone who understands they are standing inside a moment larger than the sport that produced it. "6 weeks ago," he said, "your name was in every headline in the country for something that happened off this canvas. Tonight, what does this mean to you?" Simone took the microphone. The arena was the quietest 12,000 people she had ever stood in front of. "A man put his hands on me without my consent," she said, her voice steady and clear and carrying to every corner without apparent effort. "Then he hid behind a badge and a process built to protect people like him from people like me. I filed a report. It was buried in 22 hours. She paused. "But Renata Voss had a phone and the courage to use it. And Dana Whitfield, who I met 2 weeks ago and who I will know for the rest of my life, found her voice when she finally understood she wasn't alone."
She looked directly into the camera, not at Haskins, into the lens, into the phones and the screens and the rooms where people were watching. I had a platform and a title fight and a trainer who knew journalists. Most women don't have those things. Most women who stand where I stood, in a gym, in a parking lot, in a break room, anywhere, they don't have what I had, and they deserve this just as much as I do. Maybe more. A breath. If you see something, say something. Record it. Report it. Refuse to be the person who looks away, because the people who look away are not neutral. They are the room that told him it was okay. She looked into the lens one final time. And it was never okay. The noise came back, then slowly at first, then all at once, the way things that have been held tend to release when the holding finally becomes unnecessary. And Simone handed the microphone back and walked to the cage door where Marcus was waiting, and he pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than any hug after any of the previous 11 wins, and she let him and the noise of 12,000 people continued around them. If this story moved you, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, subscribe to our channel because the next one matters just as much as this one did. Craig Dalton was convicted of sexual assault, official misconduct, and filing a false police report, and sentenced to 19 months in a federal correctional facility with an additional 6 months for the false report charge, and the court ordered $52,000 in restitution paid to Dana Whitfield. Christine and Patrice, the 3 women whose complaints had been buried while he remained on active duty, with a badge that the sentencing judge noted had been used as a weapon against the very people it existed to protect. Pete Garner submitted his resignation the day after the hearing. The union declined to contest it. Sergeant Roy Briggs was demoted and transferred. The department-wide audit Captain Mercer launched reopened 14 cases. 3 resulted in terminations. Ironwood Gym closed 8 months later. No announcement, just a sign on the door one morning and a number that no longer connected, and Gary Mullen did not release a statement about that either. Dana Whitfield received a civil settlement from the city and a formal written apology. Not a press release, not a statement to any outlet, but a letter addressed to her by name acknowledging what had been done and what had been permitted to continue for 14 months, while she transferred precincts and tried to forget. She framed it and hung it in her apartment, not because it repaired anything, but because it said her name and confirmed that what had happened to her was real, and that confirmation had taken 2 years and 1 woman loading a barbell to finally arrive. Renata Voss received the Hargrove Citizen Recognition Award and accepted it at a ceremony she almost didn't attend in a red dress with a short speech that ended, "I just pressed record. The courage was already there. I only documented it." The audit's findings were cited in a state policing reform bill that passed the following spring. 3 months after the title fight, Simone Hayes arrived at Ironwood at 6:15 in the morning. New ownership Sandra Park, who had repainted the walls and replaced the broken equipment, and posted a clear harassment policy above every squat rack in the building. Simone set her bag on the bench in the locker room, walked out to the main floor, loaded 185 pounds, chalked her hands at her feet, checked her position in the mirror, and began. The bar went up, and the bar came down.